Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt. Thank you so much for joining us again as we have the opportunity to share with the audience about the Seforim of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. I can't even keep track of what number we're up to, but we recently did two parts to the introduction of Derech Emunah, or an introduction to Derech Emunah, two parts, just going through the history of Zerayim throughout the generations. The Rishonim and the Achronim, part one was until around the 1840s, and then we continued up until where Rav Chaim wrote the Sefer in the early 1980s. So now we've actually gotten to the Sefer itself, and Rabbi Eliezer is going to start by going through Rav Chaim's Hakdama to the Sefer, where he is quite myrich about what he used, what his goals were, and what he was doing with the Sefer. The Sefer, I believe, Eliezer will tell us how many volumes it is. Definitely thousands of pages, written like the Mishna Brurah. We'll get involved in why this Sefer specifically was written this way. Have there been other Seforim that were written this way? Why didn't the Rav Chaim perhaps write this type of Sefer? We'll cover a lot of ground here, like we always do, and hope everyone enjoys it. Once again, any comments or suggestions, please reach out to myself at shwaidem@ou.org or Rabbi Brodt, Eliezer Brodt at gmail.com. If anybody would like to sponsor a shir, Baruch Hashem, this shir has been getting, I would say, close to 2,000 listens each episode and only growing. And if you want to have this chus of bringing this type of Torah adjacent content, we like to call it. So, Rabbi Brodt, do you think this qualifies as kosher entertainment?
I hope so. I hope people find it entertaining. That's the idea.
Okay, excellent. So why don't you take it away? Start.
Okay. So basically, the Derech Emunah, which Rav Chaim becomes very famous for, and probably will become more and more famous as time goes on, was first printed, I believe, in 1984. It's 4 volumes. It was printed 1 volume, and then a few years later, volumes 2 and 3 came out together. And then volume 4 came out. According to the date of the end of volume 4, it says it was in 1996 is when he finished working on it. I'm not sure if 1996 is when the last volume came out. It could be it came out a little later. It seems that there might have been delays printing. I'm not sure. Anyway, bottom line is it comes out. A few years later, a massive index comes out of 606 pages, which is called Derech Emunah Chelik Hey, which we'll get to shortly. Anyway, these volumes cover everything and anything to do with Zerayim, as we'll discuss more momentarily. Okay, it's so popular these days. There's already volumes of biurim on certain parts with footnotes and new people dealing with all different aspects of the actual Sefer. There's at least one version or 2 versions on the Hilchas Shemitah. There's a fancy version of the Hilchas Challah where they just take out Challah and they put in other materials of his from other places, and they make it into these massive works. I imagine that over time we'll see on all of Derech Emunah similar such thing. Anyway, that's some of the boring details of the actual Sefer. Volumes 2 and 3 came out together. I saw written in the Sefer Seforim, which we've quoted a bunch of times from the grandson, that it took 10 years to work on those 2 volumes alone. And then 2 years there was issues with printing, and it came out. Anyway, it seems there was even an edition that had Beis and Gimel in 1 volume. He made a very exclusive set for a few people that he gave out to. But at the end of the day, it's sold today as a 5-volume set. Anyway, not only does it have in volume 5. Okay, we'll get back to it momentarily. Okay, now what is this work in short, or maybe not in short? In the words of Rav Chaim, I've mentioned already a bunch of times, Rav Chaim has this custom, which is a great custom actually, that he talks about why he writes a particular sefer, and sometimes he actually even tells you what he used, what he's trying to bring new to the table, and that is very, very useful in general for someone when you want to talk about a sefer, and this is a very worthy endeavors. Many mechabrim, they do explain what was their goals and their methods. Most notably, the Ramah and the Beis Yosef, both of them have very, very important introductions to the Seforim where they outline their method, their psak. They even talk about a little bit about their libraries, and very important information can be learned from these such Seforim. And Rav Chaim Kanievsky, I don't know why, but he also felt it's important, and he includes some of this types of information in the Sefer. Now, so right away, he begins talking about Zerayim, and he already quotes you, there's a concept of, he starts out like this. He says like this. He says, we're in the Galus, and Kachim and Tiferes we're not able to do, okay. But we're able to learn Talmud Torah. Seder Zerayim, which is another one of the 6 Sedarim, this, even though in Chutz La'aretz we can't really observe it, but now that we live in Eretz Yisrael, there's some aspects that are Deraisa, some that are Rabbanon, and the people who live in Eretz Yisrael have the schus to be Mekayim mitzvahs atluyos ba'aretz. Okay, and he brings down different sources about it, and he brings down, amongst the things when he talks about this, is he quotes the Chai Adam in his introduction to Sefer Sharei Emunah, which we discussed last time. Where the Chai Adam says that when someone lives in the palace of the king, so to speak, Eretz Yisrael, he has to be nizar and be careful on being noig all the halachas properly. So one should know the halachas, and that was what the Chai Adam justified his writing of his Sefer for someone who's living there. So he brings that exact quote down, and he brings even more, is that there's a Sefer Charedim. If someone lives in Eretz Yisrael, you're chayiv lizar ma'oid bechol hamitzvahs atluyos ba'aretz, and shaloi tehei mitzvahs yishuv Eretz Yisrael mitzvah baba aveira. Okay, and then he brings you down some more sources like he's noig to do from different places, and he shows you, for example, people that come to visit Eretz Yisrael have to be very careful about mitzvahs atluyos ba'aretz, even if you come for a short visit. Let's say, especially this year of Shemitah, it's very important to know a little bit about what to do, what not to do. Okay. Anyway, then he goes on. Okay, so now you're supposed to know it, and we're living in Eretz Yisrael. He was living in Eretz Yisrael, so it's very important. But he says like this: in Hilchas Eretz Yisrael, l'hainu mitzvahs atluyos ba'aretz, the Paiskim were very mekatzer. They didn't really talk about it much. Why? Because it wasn't a geya in Chutz La'aretz. So even if one looks in Shulchan Aruch, you will not find too much about it. Even though in the times of the Mechaber, who was living in Eretz Yisrael in Tzfas, it should have been relevant a little bit. He says no. Lamaisa, most of the fields were not Jewish fields, probably, and he talks a little bit about this also. Okay, and therefore Hilchos Shemitah is not really brought down in Shulchan Aruch. So you open up your Yeridea, where you might think it should be in some places, it's not there. He says there's a little bit. Okay. Anyway, most other areas are not brought down in Eretz Yisrael, and this is a key point of information which he talks about over here, is in those days it was so small and everything was mostly owned by Goyim, as I just said, so therefore they really weren't meirich about this. And I had asked the question, why doesn't the Beis Yosef, who's living in Eretz Yisrael, talk about it? Why don't we see any chiburim from the Beis Yosef? So here you have Rav Chaim Kanievsky really answering the question about this topic.
It's fascinating that Rav Chaim says, since it was very small and it wasn't really relevant, so it wasn't written about. We've talked about like the opposite approach, even though it's not really relevant, but it's discussed. Rav Chaim himself does that, so this is a little bit different.
Right. Yes, correct. But anyway, he says, now, Bizmanenu, when I'm 1980s already, that we have the Eretz Yisrael, Nisraba Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and he says, Roiv HaKarkos is who's the owner? The Jews, Yehudim. So then all these halachas come back to being Nageh. So what happens is, so someone who's looking to know the halachas doesn't have where to look. He says, even though the Chai Adam, which we spoke about last time, wrote a Sefer Sharei Emunah, and we have the Sefer Pesach Shulchan, he says, so firstly he says, the Chai Adam was Mekatzer, and the Sefer Pesach Shulchan is only on Chelik and Yanim. It's only on part of the topics, which I elaborated more in the previous episode. So he says like this, comes along the Chazon Ish, and I outlined how he got till the point of the Chazon Ish in the late 1930s, when after he comes to Eretz Yisrael, he starts putting out a bunch of Seforim on Hilchos Eretz Yisrael. And he was mevar the Inyanim of Zerayim befrat with a dagesh of halacha l'maisa. But, says the Rav Chaim Kanievsky, anyone knows, and anyone in the yeshiva world knows this for sure, when you open up the Chazon Ish, you got to be holding deep in the sugya. And if you want to know a kitzer and the bottom line halacha l'maisa, it's very, very hard to find it. You have to be, he says, you have to learn a be'iyun. And you have to learn all the different things, and you have to know the different pieces in Chazon Ish in different places. He could come back and talk about it in all over in Zerayim. So he said, now, We don't even have a Gemara, as we elaborated last time also. So it's ma'oid kashel in halacha. It's all over in the Seforim Lechazanish. So he decide, and not only that, it's only in so because of all this. Bottom line, says Rav Chaim I want to make a location, a sefer that's going to have the halachas, because the Chayad and Pasach Shulchan, it's not enough. They were too makatzer, and plus, even the Chazanish, who did an excellent job, it's not in a form of halacha l'maisa that someone who wants to get to the bottom line without having to learning all the details could get to. So he says like this. He says, "Verisi ba'atzmi roiv ha'amul va'tircha." He means he was learning it, and we know this already from previous episodes. Rav Chaim used to learn Kol Tarakul every year, so Zerayim is definitely one of those areas. And when you look for any halacha, it's very hard to find. So he decided he's going to take from the Chazanish, he's going to put it on the Seder the Rambam, and he's going to make sort of, because as he said, there's no Shulchan Aruch, and he's going to make a sefer with all this material in it. Okay. He says like this, when you look in Rambam's run, it's not only mitzvah satulis baret, because there's also hilchos shatnez, tzedakah, for example, pidyon ben gets in here. So he says I'm going to put those in here also, because that's the Rambam includes that in Seder Zerayim. So you're going to have that also, and Amir Hashem will discuss that in its time. Now, okay, Ad Kan Rav Chaim explained why he did it and a little bit. So what is he? So he says, but where did I get my material from? It's not only just Chazanish and Rambam. I'm saying that would be that's not enough. So he says like this. He says I had Mishnayos. Now we have to just put this a drop in context for 1 minute. Is that today everyone's spoiled, and you could go on the internet. You have internet in your house. Most people in America, at least, and even Israel, a lot of people, whether they admit it or not. And you have Eitzar Chachma, you have Hebrew books, and you have thousands and thousands of Seforim at your fingertips. But even in the 1980s, when Chaim Kanievsky obviously started working on this probably a few years in the 1980s, didn't have all these Seforim so accessible.
I'm always amazed in Eretz Yisrael. There's a Dirshu website, which is a phenomenal website. In America, they don't have it. All the forums, that's all in Hebrew. I don't know. It seems like the American B'nai Torah are lagging behind and using the internet. But okay, that's for another conversation.
Yeah, correct. 100%. Anyway, so Bekitzer, but even in the 1980s, and as I said, he finishes as 1996, which is not so long ago, it's still not, everyone didn't have all these Seforim. And not only that, as I'm going to say, not everyone realized the significance of all these Seforim. And even today, when people have Eitzar Chachma, they still don't realize about the significance of all these Seforim. So he says like this, I had a Mishnayos, okay, because we know what we have is Mishnayos is the starting point of Zerayim. I have Yerushalmi, I have a Tosefta, I have the Rambam, okay, great. Then he says, and my good friend was working on a Yerushalmi with different Mefarshim. And he had manuscripts of the Yerushalmi, and the Rash from manuscript, and the Bir Gra from manuscript, and the Rush that we spoke about also from manuscript. And this good friend of mine, who is this good friend? This is Rav Chaim Kanievsky's, it seems to be closest friend, I believe it was Reb Dov Weintraub. And this Reb Dov was the head of a project that was putting out the Yerushalmi on multiple volumes with various Perushim, including putting it out with all these different manuscript materials. Okay, so I had all this. My good friend made this accessible to me. I also had the Rimal Kitzedek, which we discussed in the 1970s, came out from a bunch more manuscripts. So he says, what does Rav Chaim Kanievsky say? Perish Rimal Kitzedek shenidvas mechadash miktav yad. Okay, he's stressing what I'm using. Then he says, I have a new version of the Perushim Mishnayos La Rambam. We said the Rambam is one of the most important Perushim on Zerayim. It's Perushim Mishnayos. So what is this Perush that he's talking about? He has a new Perush of the Rambam. The answer is, he's alluding to, it doesn't say it out specifically, to Kapach. Rabbi Yosef Kapach, who translated from the Arabic the Perushim Mishnayos to the Rambam. And this is already, it's spoken out in the Seforim that that's what he refers to. And throughout the works of Derech Emunah, you'll find that he quotes based on a new version of the new translation. And what he really means to say is Kapach. Why he doesn't say Kapach's name anywhere, I don't know. I'm not sure. There is definitely people that grumble about Kapach, but that's beyond the scope of this. Okay. Then he says, I have all different Nusachos, which is very important. Why? Because all the different Nusachos out there a lot of times helps shed light and to understand the Sugya. Fine. Okay, so this is number one. What he has, which is a bunch of manuscripts. Obviously, this will be discussed and Mir Hashem in a future episode, much more about this. Okay, then he says, I have the Mefarshim on Mishnayos. Besides, I have a stand. Today everyone, when you learn Mishnayos, today probably more and more it's becoming that people just use the art scroll Mishnayos. But even a few years ago, before people would use Kahati, or some people that don't like to use Kahati, they used to use it called Mishnayos with Yachan Avayas. It's printed in Vilna and has multiple Perushim on the side, very important Perushim. He says, besides that I had that Mishnayos and used it, but I also had a bunch of Perushim on Mishnayos. What do I have? So first he tells us he has Rabbeinu Nassim. Who's Rabbeinu Nassim? From the top, early on, also printed from manuscript in more recent years. Then he has the Beis David and the Sheshanim L'David. So this is its own shmooze, which we're not going to go through now. But basically, these are very important Perushim HaMishnayos written by the Chazdei David. That's the Sheshanim David, and it's replying a lot to the Chibur Beis David. And he also has the Lechem Shamayim and Mishna Lechem of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, which we spoke a drop about in one of the shiurim on Masechtas Tainus, I believe it was. Okay. Then he has Eitz Chaim from Rav Chagiz. Now, what's significant is basically he's telling you, and when he was writing this was very important. It wasn't enough to just learn Mishnayos and have the different Mefarshim. You need to look at all the different Perushim on Mishnayos, and this is what Chaim Kanievsky did. Okay. Then he says that what about we already mentioned since there's no Bavli, you got to jump to Yerushalmi. So he's just said Yerushalmi I had manuscripts. And he adds I also had Perushim on Yerushalmi besides the standard Perushim. He says I had Rash Sirluf, which we discussed by Richos, because it only started coming out manuscript on Zerayim in recent years, as we listed out. Then I have the Stei Yeshua, Mari Fulda, Sefer Nir, and Noam Yerushalmi, which we also spoke about from Razel Harif. Then he says, what else do you got to learn? You got to look at the Tosefta. Who's in the Tosefta besides your standard Vilna Shas Tosefta? So he says he had the Chazdei David, from again one of the most incredible works on Tosefta, which today it's more available, but for centuries it was unavailable. And the Chazon Yecheskel from Yecheskel Abramsky. Okay, fine. Now, we're talking about Rambam. So he says, let me tell you what I have in the Rambam besides the standard Rambam. I have a Kiryat Sefer. So that, more famous, everyone knows, when you learn Rambam, you always got to use the Kiryat Sefer. I heard from a Rav recently giving a shir, he said, Briskers are very fond of the Kiryat Sefer. They're constantly always trying to shtup in a shtickle ter of the Rambam that, like the Kiryat Sefer. Okay. Anyway, that was a cute line that this Rav said over. Anyway, and then he lists out a few other Mefarshim he has. Fine. Then he goes on. It's also important to know about the Tiferes Yisroel and the Seforim. So what do I have? Again, manuscripts. Because of the Rabbeinu Hillel, I have a Rash Mishans, I have a Ravid. Fine. Say that. So this is the main text. Now, what about, is there any other Seforim that he uses? So it's interesting. He says, I have the Sharei Tzedek of the Chai Adam, the Pas HaShulchan, and then he says, I have the Aruch HaShulchan Nitfas Mechadash Al Zerayim. So here again, just to stress, he says, I'm using the Aruch HaShulchan, which we also discussed was a brand new discovery that no one knew about, that even existed, and it was all of a sudden, the late 30s, 40s, it comes out, and he's using it. One goes through Derech Emunah, you'll find that he quotes Derech HaShulchan all the time. Okay, and yes, he quotes Chayad and Pas HaShulchan also all the time. Now, then he has the Tiferes Yisroel, which we spoke about, and the Mikdash David. So this is just to throw out there. A lot of people are very fond of saying Rav Chaim Kanievsky is not into London, he's not a London, he's a Bucky. Without getting into this at this point, maybe we will elaborate a drop about it one day. But here we see he was concerned about these Seforim too, and he brings down the Brisker Lamdus and the Mikdash David, these Lamdish Seforim also, and one looks through the Derech Emunah, you'll see that he quotes them. Fine. And then he says, of course, back to the Chazon Ish and what materials he's using for the Chazon Ish. Fine. So Ad Kan, we have the list of what Rav Chaim Kanievsky says I'm using for my Chibur. Now, so that's part one. What is he using? I have all these materials. Fine. Now, how does he...
So if I can throw out a question, you've talked about it this episode, other episodes, all these Kisvei Yad, how did Rav Chaim Kanievsky, who l'chayra sat at Rashban 23 in his apartment learning day and night, where did he get access to all these Seforim? Did someone bring them to him? Where did he go? I know you mentioned once he went to Tel Aviv. You have any idea?
So I hope to devote a whole episode to this sugya because it's much more than just that he got it. It's the fact that he used it, because he can really make your question even stronger. it's very well known in the yeshiva world that the main person, I would say, in the past century that was against using all these manuscripts is the Chazon Ish. How could someone such as Rav Chaim Kanievsky, the greatest Talmud of the Chazon Ish, or one of the greatest Talmud of the Chazon Ish, how could he use it throughout his Seforim? Excellent. And how he got them also is an excellent question. And hopefully we will, Mir Hashem, devote a whole episode to discussing all about this, because it plays out in all the Seforim of Chaim Kanievsky, especially in Derech Emunah. But so therefore, there's no short answer. Sorry, I would love to give you a short answer. There's no short answer. But okay, now what's significant is that how does he? Okay, so now we said his library, and in general, just to throw out there, it's very, very important to know the library of a particular gadol. When you learn various svarim, it helps one understand when they bring down quotes. If you know what sefer he's using, sometimes you want to look it up. If he's quoting from a secondary source, what svarim he held is important to use. And you say someone wants to learn Zerayim, here you have a blueprint. Rav Chaim Kanievsky is telling you these svarim are very important to use when you're learning Zerayim. Okay, anyway, but now we have that. How does he set up the sefer? That is the question. How does he set up the sefer? So he goes on and he tells us, I'm setting it up like the Mishnah Brurah. Why? It's easy to learn, and so what does he do? The top part is the text, is the Rambam. Then he has a beer on the side, and then a more be'indik beer, and then sources on the bottom. Okay. Now, before we discuss this, he basically, if you open up the shar of the actual sefer, he says the first part is the Rambam, Mishna Torah Sefer Zerayim, and that's the text, the prime text. And then on the right side, on certain pages, and obviously on the other side, Derech Emunah is like the Mishnah Brurah, Mamish the Mishnah Brurah. Then he has a chibur called Bir Halacha, like the Bir Halacha. And the bottom, when you open up your standard Mishnah Brurah, there's a Sharei Tzion. He calls it Tzion Halacha. Now, he says in the shar of his sefer, he says, what's the beer? What he calls Derech Emunah. He's going to be mavar the Rambam, making a lika from Rabbi Seina Mefarshim, bringing other Rishayim, and he's going to try to do it in a Kitzur Lashon. And he also befrat misifrim Rambal HaKitzur HaChazon Ish. Fine. The Lashon tzach the Kitzur. For what reason? Leman Yorut, so someone could run through Kol Kair v'Yachol Kol Echo Achzer Al Kol Hilchos Ram Bizman Kitzur. I don't know how fast you could really learn all his Ram doing this, but that's what he says. Then he says, I have a Bir Halacha. What's the Bir Halacha? Mevar Kamapam Divrei Halacha. In the Derech Emunah Mekatzer. Here I'm going to go through the sugya. And then Tzion Halacha, I'm going to give you Makairis. I didn't just make up this stuff. So I'm going to give you Makairis for this. Now, what has to understand over here is that the Bir Halacha, and this I would like to explain a little bit more, is that when he says that I'm going to do the Bir Halacha, what does this mean? So, right now, the way he says it is it's a sort of a copy of the Mishnah Brurah. When you open up Mishnah Brurah and you open up this, it looks the same. Now, there is a very, very fundamental difference, and this is a very interesting nakuda to know about the Mishnah Brurah. Everyone knows that the Mishnah Brurah is sefer, and then he has a Mishnah Brurah, and then he has on the side he has a chibur which he calls Bir Halacha, and the bottom is Sharei Emunah. So Sharei Emunah is ha'aris where the Makairos are from, and sometimes he'll have a very brisk comment. And Bir Halacha is he goes through the sugya. Now, the Chafetz Chaim does not go through every single sugya in Orach Chaim in the Bir Halacha. There could sometimes be whole samanim where he doesn't say anything in Bir Halacha. And why is that? And when you compare this to the Bir Halacha of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, literally he doesn't miss a thing. And these Bir Halachas sometimes could be even a few pages long. He goes through the sugya. He has everything, in my grubber terms, he throws in the whole kitchen sink. He brings you down all the Rishayim. He brings you everything. You see Rav Chaim Kanievsky writing out very, very clear how he got through the whole sugya from the Mishna, from Yerushalmi, from the whatever he's using as disposal, and he's handling different things, and it'll be Mafalpal and Chazon Ish's, but many other stuff, which we'll see more. So, but if you look at the Mishnah Brurah, Bir Halacha, many times there's no Bir Halacha. What? The Chafetz Chaim didn't have what to say about all of Orach Chaim? So this is the Yisait. The Yisait is that, back to the Sefer, which I already quoted numerous times, and I will continue to quote him because we'll get to more aspects, is the Chafetz Chaim's son, who took part of the writing of the Mishnah Berurah with his father, he gives us insight. He says like this: the Chafetz Chaim did not feel that he needs to put in every single piece of Torah that he has on Derech Chaim into his Mishnah Berurah. Then the volume would have been much bigger. He put in things that he felt was important. Also, it's interesting, I think he writes this somewhere also, that he wants to show that it's just not, he didn't just like make up these halachas and he collected them from a bunch of sources, that he checked up these sugyas properly. But not everything one sees or learns or writes is meant to be for printing. So much so that he writes that when he was young, Rabbi writes that my father saw that I'm writing notes, stamazai, and he was like, why are you writing stamazai? If it's not for print, and not everything you write should be printed anyway. The Chafetz Chaim had an interesting approach that not everything. A lot of people, especially today, Baruch Hashem, everyone has computers, so everyone likes to write much more than ever before. I mean, just look during the Corona, the amount of articles that came out, whole Seforim about every single topic. People were stuck at home. Not only Seforim related to Corona, many Seforim came out afterwards because people, Baruch Hashem, had time to learn. But before Corona, even the computer age brought on that everyone is able to write, and people like to write, and it's a very good thing. The Chafetz Chaim didn't hold that everything that one writes should be put out for the masses. So even though the Chafetz Chaim, who we know and we would love to have much more Bir Halacha, he didn't print all that he had to say about Rav Chaim in his work on Mishnah Berurah. Whereas the Rav Chaim Kanievsky, he held and he put in everything. I mean, say there you definitely can't, as he says when he talks about the chelik called Derech Emunah, you can run through it. You definitely cannot do that by the Bir Halacha. You got to be holding be'iyun into the sugya with the Makairis, and then only then maybe would one be able to understand what's going on and what he's adding to the sugya, if he's adding, where he's arguing, etc., etc. But okay, so this is a fundamental, interesting thing that even though he's copying the Mishnah Berurah, there's a fundamental difference, is that the Mishnah Berurah's Bir Halacha is much shorter than his Bir Halacha. Okay, now. Just to mention, as time is short, we'll just mention two more nakudis related to this, and that is like this. He emphasizes, and this also I hope to devote its own nakuda, to more arichos about it, is he stresses everywhere possible that this is not halacha l'maisa. You say the Mishnah Berurah, everyone knows that's the go-to halacha l'maisa sefer. Says Rav Chaim Kanievsky already in the shar of my sefer, that it's not chas v'shalom loyers halacha l'maisa misefer zeh. That's not the tachlis. It's only for what lechazer the halacha is bekitzer. So you should remember it, and it should be easy to find, but not to do it. Then at the end of his introduction, he says, "Ein matras hasefer elalikut mar mekaymes shalachas b'malkom echad. It's musudar." Then after this introduction, he has in bold letters, "Chayzer ala rishonim lahoydish hasefer zein lifsek halacha l'maisa." Then he says, "I'm bringing down different things." No. Even Mashuva b'shem Rabbi Seina Paiskim ein zel atzaz devarim kedei sheyeda malachapes b'makaymes. It should be easy to look. The Kol Shekain, what he says, my thing, don't rely on it halacha l'maisa. You got to speak to a Baal Hira Muvak or learn the sugya properly, etc., etc. So I'm pointing out now another fundamental difference between the Derech Emunah and the Chafetz Chaim. Okay, and just to end over here, he says. He does bring down the Chazon Ish. Why? He says he's bringing down the Chazon Ish again. We already mentioned this, and in other Seforim also, because hu basra umara the Arad Yisrael va'amud ha'ira, especially in the Inyanim of mitzvahs atloyis ba'aretz. Okay, fine. Adkan from the introduction for now. So just to clarify and add a drop to what I said already today. So Derech Emunah. A few boring points just to run through them. So Derech Emunah is a pirish on the Rambam. So one would expect when you open up your Derech Emunah, where's going to be the hasagas of the Ravid on the Rambam, and you will be shocked to see it's not there. So the answer is, it's for some reason the Stipler held that it shouldn't be printed in this. So in the 4 volumes, the Ravid hasagas are not printed. He does deal with Ravids in the Derech Emunah all the time, but it's not printed. And volume Hey, which is mostly the 606-page index on the whole Derech Emunah, he put in all the Ravids on Zerayim. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 is, we discussed already in the first episode about a chibur of that Rav Chaim Kanievsky was very into seeking out Makairis of the Rambam. And he wrote a sefer called Kiryat Melech. So when Zerayim, now that he's writing a sefer which is Be'ikar on Zerayim, it seems he has new materials relating to that Kiryat Melech and some other materials that are not found in the Kiryat Melech, and that is also found in volume 5 of the Derech Emunah. Okay, and there are differences. There's, one should still use the Kiryat Melech, but also in this chibur, it's printed in the back in volume Hey. Okay, that's another thing to throw out there. Another thing is like this. Rav Chaim Kanievsky, we're talking about that the Derech Emunah is his major monumental project on Mitzvah Satulis Bards, the Seder Zram. So after this work came out, he put out a work called Sharei Emunah, and interestingly enough, it's called in the Hagdama of the Sefer Sharei Emunah, we read as follows: that while I was learning Zerayim, so I saw that there's, even though we have the Rash and the Rambam and all these different Farshim, but there's something that's missing. What's missing? A chibur in the derech of the Marsha. So I'm going to write such a work that's daima to the Marsha. Now this goes great because one of the earlier episodes we explained how the Chazon Ish is very into the Marsha, and Chaim Kanievsky, where a whole chibur, one of his earliest chiburim, is on the Marsha. So it's interesting that Zram, he felt it's missing Marsha, and he's going to copy something to do with the Marsha in this chibur Sharei Emunah. It's 3 volumes available on Hebrew books, at least maybe 2 of them, maybe 3 of them. But it's also an in-depth work focusing more on the Rash and the Rambam. A lot of materials you would have to still seek out in Derech Emunah. Anyway, it's another volume. It's another 3 volumes of his when one is learning Zerayim to keep to know about. Okay, now, and just 2 more pitchifkas, as I like to call them, is the Chafetz Chaim wrote a Mishnah Brura. So I have been asked, and I've seen asked, why didn't the Chafetz Chaim, Mishnah Brura is on Ar Chaim, why didn't the Chafetz Chaim write in Yeridei? So that he was asked and he answered that. It's a different shmooze. But what about Zerayim? So in the work that I've quoted already today and many other times, is the Chafetz Chaim's son says, someone asked him, why don't you write a sefer Psak Halacha on Seder Zerayim? There's some Yidden living in Eretz Yisrael already in the 1930s, 1920s, whenever this question was asked. So the Chafetz Chaim said, give me 20 years and I'll write you a chibur, a halachadik chibur on Zerayim. Now, I don't know how long it took Rav Chaim Kanievsky. We do have better technology than the Chafetz Chaim's time, but it could be it took him 20 years. We don't know exactly when he began working on it. Maybe people in the know do know, and in the light of the amount of literature that's coming out of Rav Chaim Kanievsky on the steady daily basis between the internet and actually Seforim and Shuvas, could be someone will say specifically which day even he began, but I don't know yet to answer that question. It could be it did take him 20 years. Anyway, and one last... I mentioned also that that there's a fundamental difference between the Bir Halachas of the Bir Halacha of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, whereas the Bir Halacha of the Chafetz Chaim. So I meant to quote a few minutes ago when I was talking about it that the actual lashon of the Chafetz Chaim's son is that when my father wrote the Bir Halacha, he was very careful not to show off. It was not to go with begadlus laharich bepilpulim laharois karifasi. He didn't want to so he felt that there's no need to just put out everything, all the possible Torahs that he had related to Ar Chaim into the Mishnah Brura. He also points out that it would have been very expensive to put in everything about relating to Ar Chaim, starting from scratch. It'll be endless. Just to get an idea, one of Rabbi Yosef's sons has started a series called Halacha Brura. They're holding, I think, something like 20 volumes, and they're still only in what's called, would be equivalent to Mishnah Brura Chelik Gimel. And this is where they officially go through all the sugyas, by simon, all the Rishayim, Achrayim, Chuvas, everything. And this is on everything. It's 20 volumes with today's technology. So, okay. Anyway, now, the Rav Chaim Kanievsky, interesting, it seems someone must have written to him a letter about that you're copying the Mishnah Brura, something to the effect. I don't know if it was a title. We don't have what the letter was. But anyway, he says it's not. There are similarities, says Rav Chaim Kanievsky in this letter, but it's definitely, there's many differences. One of them he says is that the Chafetz Chaim was a goyin otzam ish kodesh ubal ruach hakodesh. So I'm not in that league, says Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Another thing is he says Chafetz Chaim wrote a Sefer Halacha L'Maisa, and I'm not writing my Sefer Halacha L'Maisa. Okay, he does say some other things, which we'll return to shortly. Okay, Al-Qaban, these are some of the things I just wanted to clarify from what I said already, and now we can move forward.
Okay, Rabbi Eliezer, you're the perfect person. If anyone knows this, you probably did research on it. Was Rav Chaim the first person that wrote a sefer in the style of a Mishnah Brura? You've told me in the past this expression of mak Mishnah Bruras. So has this been tried? Has there been back and forth about this? Fill us in on that topic of mak Mishnah Bruras.
Okay, so it's very. I'll tell you like this. My when I moved to Ramat Beit Shemesh, I was zeicha that my Rav, until he was suddenly nifter, was Rav Chaim Zev Melanowitz. And one of the things he was very fond of was what he called fake Mishnah Brurahs. And he had a special collection of all of the different fake Mishnah Brurahs. And anytime someone else would put out a Mishnah Brurah, a fake Mishnah Brurah, which I'm going to explain what that means, he would buy it automatically, even if it was good, not good, he would buy it. And there are many. And what it means is like this. The Mishnah Brurah, it seems it could be the Mishnah Brurah himself came up with this. I'm not clear yet if someone else did it before him. But basically, Mishnah Brurah we know had on top is the Mechaber / Ramah. On the side, he actually has the Baradoila. Then he has the Shari Tshuva Ber Heitev, which why he didn't take out is beyond the scope. And then he has his Mishnah Brurah, Ber Halacha, and bottom is Sharatzion. So, and we've already explained earlier today what the points of these things are. And Rav Chaim Kanievsky copied that without minus the Shari Tshuva / Ber Heitev Baradoila. Okay. Now, what the benefit of this is, already Rav Chaim caught on to this, is one could have halacha l'maisa, sources, and the parts in different sections. So someone wants to just get the bottom line, has one parish to look at. Someone wants to look at the sugyas, has one thing. Someone just wants to know sources, has the bottom. So it's a very good setup. So what happened is that in already from when the Mishnah Brurah did this, many people, I don't know the exact dating, I didn't map it out, but already from when the Mishnah Brurah started to do this, some works came out doing a similar type thing. Now, in more recent years, after the Mishnah Brurah, there has been an explosion of such works, literally an explosion. Yesterday, I was just looking randomly in shul. Yesterday, the day before, I opened up different Seforim, not for this reason at all. All of a sudden, look, there's another Mishnah Brurah. I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this. You open them up. Now, a few years ago, a friend of mine, Professor Yaakov Spiegel, wrote about this phenomena in a sefer of his on the history of Seforim called Amudim B'Tol the Sefer Ivri. So it's a 5 volumes currently. In the 4th volume, I believe he has a whole arichos about this concept. That and he lists out and he discusses the differences that there are mak Mishnah Brurah, so to speak, on Dalech Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. You'll find people take a topic. There's one on Yerid. There's a few on Yeridea. They're not on the whole Yeridea a lot of times. They could be just on a specific simon, but they decide that that's the best way to do it. And he lists out and discusses the different aspects about it in his Sefer Amud Tal Sefer Ivri. He lists out different in Dalech Chelkei Shulchan Aruch with this. Okay. Interestingly enough, someone wrote a review where he sort of had, I don't know exactly what his criticism was, but he has some criticism about why Rav Chaim Kanievsky did this. Okay, but as the whole, there's so many of these Seforim out there. There's actually a fellow that wrote an article after Spiegel's material came out, using Spiegel and more. His name is Hariel Devere, and he wrote an article. It's titled "Seforim B'Tavnit HaMishnah Brurah Signon Ktiva Chadash Ba'olam Halacha." And where is this printed? This is printed as an online journal that comes out monthly, Ha'oitzer, and it's affiliated with Oitzer Chachma. And they put out once a month a journal. Sometimes going to be 300 pages of all different types of articles, and one could get the PDF. One could get a sign up for the journal and get it every month in the beginning of the month. Anyway, this fellow wrote a listing out on Dalech Chelkei Shulchan Aruch what there is. So if let's say you want to know Simon these Simonim, is there such a mak Mishnah Brurah? He even did even more. He adds links, so you could hit a link and you could get the Hebrew books if some of them are in Hebrew books, some of them are only on Eitzar Chachma, some of them are not. And he has this long list, and he says he hopes to update it Keseder. And there's numerous works. Not only is it on Dalech Chelkei Shulchan Aruch, the Spiegel also deals with, people took sections of the Rambam, similar to what Rav Chaim Kanievsky did for Zerayim, they did for other sections, and there's coming out in Tiferes, a few of them are out there. I just picked up a massive one recently done on Saita. and they're all incredible. Now some of them go very far, because if we said Rav Chaim Kanievsky had the Bir Halacha of Rav Chaim Kanievsky is very far from the Bir Halacha of the Chafetz Chaim, some of these guys go much further than Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and they have tons and tons of Torah. But at least there's breaks, and it's easy to use. Anyway. And for Americans, very famous is that we have one of the big poskim in America, Rav Cohen. He wrote the Badei Shulchan, which is also this type of style. His Bir Halacha is, I would say, closer to the Chafetz Chaim's, not Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and definitely not like some of these Heintig Mechabrim. His son also is Rabbi Yamin Cohen, also has been following in this and put out also a bunch of volumes. And so we have in America representation of this phenomena also. It could be there's many others that are also from America. I did not exactly trace the whole story. Just to end, one Nakuda is that not only is halachadik Seforim, so I've quoted already a few times this Rav Tiger, who was very close with Rav Chaim Kanievsky, so he did it for Rambam Tshuva, a massive, incredible work that has thousands of hours from Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Okay, that's the Rambam. He did it in Hilchos Talmud Torah, that's similar to the Mishnah Brurah, but then he also did is he took the Chazon Ish, and he wrote about the Chazon Ish. On the top part, he has some Lashonis, and then he has a Bir Halacha and Mishnah Brurah and Sharei Emunah, all about the Mahalach Halimud and Psak of the Chazon Ish. Not a collection of specific Psakim and Archaim through Dal Chagol Shulchan, but the history of the Chazon Ish and days of the Chazon Ish in the form of Mishnah Brurah. It's a very cute booklet one could see, just to show you how it looks. It's called Kunshas Derech Ish. You open it up, and it has on the top, you can see a mechaber, and then it has the materials. Okay. Anyway, it's a cute thing just to know about. Fine. So this is Adkan about the Mak Mishnah Brurahs, or whatever best word suits to discuss it. But it's a big phenomena, and I'm sure it's going to get more and more as time goes on. And if anyone wants the article of this Reb Devere, you could send me an email, and I'll send you this article, which lists out a lot of the such works that are active. Okay. So Adkan, we discussed a little bit about the similarities with the Mishnah Brurah and Rav Chaim Kanievsky's introduction in Derech Emunah. Now, the first thing is I would like to compare my introduction to Derech Emunah was two parts. It was the Rishonim and Achronim that are on Zerayim. So did Rav Chaim? How does that list that I gave compare with Rav Chaim Kanievsky? So that's number one, and then obviously number two is, are there Seforim that are not listed, and is there a reason behind why they're not listed? And then after that, Amir Tashem, in the next episodes, we'll start going into the actual different aspects into the actual Derech Emunah. Okay, so just briefly, we at the time, just in the previous episodes, we went through various Rishonim. So there's the Rimalki Tzedek, the Rambam Pershim Mishnayos, Rami Yarech Hazaka, the Rambam using Kapach. All this Rav Chaim Kanievsky says I'm using with the best manuscripts. Rash Mishans, we also mentioned edition with manuscripts. Again, Rav Chaim Kanievsky says in his introduction he's using it. Sefer Truma, we discussed that. Rav Chaim Kanievsky uses this throughout. We mentioned Hilchos Tur Miyuchas L'Eretz Yisrael that was only discovered in the 1900s. Rav Chaim Kanievsky definitely uses that. He does not mention it in his introduction, but he uses it a bunch of times in Derech Emunah. What about the Kafta Vaferach? For some reason, he does not mention it in the introduction, but he uses it Keseder a lot, and we will get to actually more about that in a later episode. Marash Sirlof, all the time he quotes it. It was, as I said, it started coming out from Bnei Brak people even, and he quotes it Keseder. Okay, moving on to the Achronim, Chayad and Pasa Shulchan, he discusses it in the introduction. He talks about it, and he definitely uses them Keseder. Tiferes Yisroel from Moshe Clears, the Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid, the Migdash David, the Tiferes Ram, and the Reb Chanach Grossberg, which we also discussed. He uses his works in his Derech Emunah. Okay. And obviously the Chazon Ish, he uses Keseder in his, through that's on every page, you'll find numerous things from the Chazon Ish. But, okay, now, in this letter that I quoted, in the Sefer called Igrus Uksavim Derech Emunah, where someone was asking him, comparing the Mishnah Brurah to the Derech Emunah, so he says, not only, Rav Chaim Kanievsky already points out that the Mishnah Brurah, one of the goals of the Mishnah Brurah was he was trying to get all the Achronim and to mevar everything. But he says, I'm not trying to do that, says Rav Chaim Kanievsky. I'm not writing Lamaisa. I looked at the Seforim on the Rambam and the stuff that I list out in my Abdama, and Be'ikr the Chazon Ish, but I'm not trying to see every sefer that's out there. Furthermore, he says, I didn't have everything. I'm not being a ma'asef l'kol ha'machnos. And I never write anywhere that I'm trying to include all the information. So if I'm missing things, it could be I didn't have the Seforim in my possession. Now, why is this significant? This is significant is because of what I'm about to discuss right now. And that is, looking and comparing from what I said in the introduction about learning Zerayim, especially in the Achronim, and also some new additions, there are certain Seforim that Rav Chaim sometimes he uses and he doesn't talk about, and sometimes he doesn't use. And the question is, why not? Okay, let's go in order. So, one Chibur, which Rav Chaim he doesn't have to list it out because it's included in the Mishnayos in Mishnayos Vilna, which is the Tiferes Yisroel. So, Tiferes Yisroel, besides for writing his Pirish, which was put into, it's called Yachar Bayaz, he also wrote various Hagdamas to different parts of Mishnayos, and sometimes he has other Chiburim. Like for Shabbos, he has an excellent Chibur, which is quoted Halacha L'Maisa in many Paiskim, and for Klayim, he has a Chibur called Batei Klayim, all about Hilchos Klayim. It's only about 10, 12 pages, and it has approximately 150 parts with information. Rav Chaim quotes this throughout the Chibur of Derech Emunah in Hilchos Klayim, but he also quotes Tiferes Yisroel all the time. So it could be he didn't put in his introduction because it's only on Klayim, it's not on the rest of his Ram, so he didn't feel that he has to spell it out. And also he says that I'm using the Mishnayos Vilna. Now, interesting is that Tiferes Yisroel, without getting barichus, over the years has gotten flack. And just to quote one such source, there was a very interesting Yid, Rabbi Yukassil Aryeh Kemelhar, and Rabbi Shua Munshine, also an interesting person, put out a very thorough book based on manuscript materials that are currently housed in the Hebrew University Library, a whole thorough book about him. It's one of the Seforim that he wrote deals with Chazal, science, and all these different inyanim. And someone wrote different letters criticizing. He puts in some excerpts of letters that people criticized Rav Kemelhar. So in the Masalan, you could see that he says he lists out a bunch of Seforim that Hasidim used to not learn. He says one such sefer is what? Mishnayos and Tiferes Yisroel. They didn't learn Mar Nevuchim, they didn't learn Malbim, they didn't learn Akedah, they didn't learn Kuzari. But he says, look, those Hasidim, this Rav Kemelhar writes, what ended up happening? It ends up getting quoted plenty. And so anyway, but there were people in different times, certain passages in Tiferes Yisroel got people nervous. But anyway, be that as it may, Rav Chaim does quote the Tiferes Yisroel Keseder in Derech Emunah. He just doesn't mention in the Hagdama, and especially on Klayim, this Chibur that I mentioned, this 11-page Chibur, he deals with Keseder. Okay. There's another person, and this person I forgot to mention in the introduction about Derech Emunah, is Moshe Kahanow. Who was he? He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Eitz Chaim. He dies in 1887, a Litvak who made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, and in the 1860-ish around, and he's a Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Eitz Chaim, very close with Reb Shmuel Salant. I think for some reason I recall that he was in Volozhin. He wrote a bunch of Chashuv Svarim. Most importantly, is he wrote 2 small Svarim on Zram. And this would need to correct what I said earlier in the previous episode. In the 1880s, there was 2 small Svarim written on Hilchos Zram, and this was written by this Moshe Kahanow.
Maybe perhaps he's forefather to the Kahana family that was in Tarvadas, and it was Rabbi Kahanow.
I don't know. I mamish don't know. They're much more Hasidish. But it could be they are somehow connected. I'm not sure. But anyway, he's a very, very interesting person. His Shittas in Eretz Yisrael in the 1870s, the 1880s, but it's not for now. But Al-Kapanim, he has 2 Svarim, at least 2 Svarim of his are related to Zerayim. One's called Eretz Chayfetz, which Chaim Kanievsky I did notice quote sometimes. I didn't check how many times, but he has a Sefer Chukas Olam, which I did not notice Chaim Kanievsky quoting, but it requires further iyun because it's not so easy to check what Chaim Kanievsky quotes, because a lot of times he uses Rashi Tevis, and he used different types of Rashi Tevis, so it's not always easy to check if he did quote it or not. Okay. Another person which I omitted, which is embarrassment for me, is that Aderes, who comes to Yerushalayim, and he's the last few years of his life. He was supposed to take over Reb Shmuel Salant. He ends up dying before Reb Shmuel Salant, but he comes to Eretz Yisrael to be the Rav of Yerushalayim. There's a whole big tumult about who is going to be the Rav of Yerushalayim. There's a lot about that. But anyway, Aderes, one of the things that he was very involved with when he came, we have a lot of accounts about it. One could find in this book, Shlomo Albert, Aderes Elio. He was also involved with the different aspects of Yishuv Eretz, of Mitzvah Tluis Ba'aretz, fixing it up, making takanas, and he actually even wrote a sefer or two, which maybe we'll get to, maybe we won't in a different episode, that relates to Mamish Mitzvah Tluis Ba'aretz, one of the issues that comes up, one area at least. Okay. Anyway, that's Aderes. Okay. Now, I mentioned barichos, not a real barichos, but I mentioned that where I felt it started, Zerayim began being learned was from a kail Kerem Tzvi from Rabbi Yitzchak, which was the founder was Rabbi Yitzchak Rosenthal, and the heads of this kail was Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank and Rabbi Zalman. Now this kail I mentioned, they put out a kavitz keseder. This kavitz, maybe at least 8 volumes, called Kerem Tzion. I think that's the name, and I said it's mentioned on Hebrew books. Now, who was the Rosh of this kail? Tzvi Pesach Frank. Now, Tzvi Pesach Frank already was one of the great Dayanim, very close to Rosh Salant, incredible individual, which is kedai to be meir on him a lot, but not now. Akopanim, he was an expert in Zerayim. He was the Pesach of Yerushalayim. Not only was he an expert in Zerayim, he wrote a lot about Zerayim. A lot of the material is found already in these volumes. Interestingly enough, these 8 massive volumes are not quoted in Derech Emunah. I located one time, and it's very strange. Why not? Now, I don't have an answer.
You mean you've gone through the whole Derech Emunah already, Ian, so you know exactly where everything's quoted?
No. I wish. But I looked around a lot of places in the Seforim. I looked through many different parts in Derech Emunah, learned different sections already. I did not systematically go line by line in the thing. But he does. But also after a while, once you find different things, you could search different words and different things. But anyway, I noticed one time he quotes it. He does quote this kavitz one time, and it's his brother-in-law that he's quoting, Rav Yidelovich.
You're not giving away all your secrets.
That what?
You're not giving away all your secrets.
Oh, how to do it? No, I will definitely not. Magicians never give away the magic tricks. Anyway, but what's significant is Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank wrote a lot about Zerayim. So much so that if you buy a Chuvas Har Tzvi, one will see that 2 volumes of it are devoted to Zerayim. So to be fair, they start coming out in the 80s and later on. But there's no mention, you will not find a mention of Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank in the Derech Emunah. Now, some people find this, could be very bothered by it, because if this is the point of the Sefer is to take everything, so why isn't it there? So already the letter that I'm quoting from Chaim Kanievsky says, I'm not trying to quote everything. Just because he happens to quote a crazy amount of material, he's off the hook, because he says, I'm not trying to quote everything. Chazon Ish is by me what I'm trying to quote. If you get me on a Chazon Ish, then Chaim Kanievsky would say, then that's important. But everything else, what he puts in, but not everything is in there. Now, interestingly enough, and this is something I'm definitely not going into, but I will say the following story, and this will give us perhaps some context to why Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank is not quoted in the Sefer. And that is as follows. When I was a bacher, I was once I learned in the Mir, and I was learning in the Eitzer, and somehow there was some people got into a fight about something. I don't remember how it started. And then somehow someone said something, and then normally I would never pipe up. I said, something, what do you mean? Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank says it's mutter, whatever the fight was about. So the guy goes, Rav Hirsch Pesach? We already know the Chazon Ish doesn't hold of him. I'm like, what? Anyway, I controlled myself. I said, okay, you understand what you're saying. Rav Zalman held his Rebbe in Halacha, is one of his main rabbis is Tzvi Pesach. What are you even talking about? But I held myself back. But I was curious. What did this yeshivish guy mean when he said this? Like to push away Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank, and he wasn't even in Bnei Brak. This is taking place in Yerushalayim in the Mir Eitzer. I was very bothered by it. So I had a relationship with a very chashuv Yerushalmi Yid. His name was Rabbi Tzeinvart. So next time I spoke to him, I asked him. I said, "What's the story with Tzvi Pesach Frank?" I said, "Now, to understand this, Rabbi Tzeinvart, he was came from a kanoistic shita of Yerushalayim, a very close to the Eidech Haredis. But he said, Tzvi Pesach Frank, unbelievable. I knew him very well. I spent a lot of time talking to him and learning and halacha and all different things. I said, what's the story with the Chazon Ish? So he said, the Chazon Ish did have tainus on him in different aspects. Most of it had to do with an yani of Shemitah. But he said, I'm going to tell you a Maisa, and you'll understand sometime from this Maisa the way different Gedolim, and then the way some things turn out from this. And it'll be clear from the following Maisa. Maisa was as it seems Rabbi Yosef had a very good friend that learned a lot by a very close friend, Rav Chaim Brim, very famous person. And Rav Chaim Brim learned a lot by the Chazon Ish. And he would come from Bnei Brak to Yerushalayim Keseder. He lived in Yerushalayim. And he would tell over what he told over stuff that was going on in Bnei Brak by the Chazon Ish. So one time he came back and said the Chazon Ish is mamish he's very, very bothered by a certain kasha. I think it was in Kachim. And he didn't have an answer. And he was mamish breaking his head over this topic. So they asked the kasha to Tzvi Pesach without batting an eyelash. Tzvi Pesach Frank gives an answer. So they bring back the answer to the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish mamish gets up, mamish Weiss the Chois Rav Hirsch Pesach learned Torah Lishma. Basically, the Tzvi Pesach we see that he learned Torah Lishma. So now, Rabbi Yosef was telling me was like this. They had a machlokes, and the machlokes was a sharp machlokes. It was negay in Yanim of Shemitah. But even though they had a machlokes, the Chazon Ish still held Tzvi Pesach as Tzvi Pesach. Not like this bacher who was being, besides that he's a young whippersnapper, as they would call him, maching avek or Tzvi Pesach. Even though the Chazon Ish argues on Tzvi Pesach, you have to put it in perspective. And a lot of times, in a lot of machlokes, and especially today, the outsiders, the people that are not into the learning, they take and get carried away with machlokes, and that might be a machlokes l'shem shamayim and stuff that's beyond us. Now, it happens to be that in recent years there has bin more material about the machlokes of the Chazon Ish and with Tzvi Pesach relating to Shemitah. One such set of materials can be found in the Gnazim of the Chazon Ish that I've quoted a bunch of times. That there's been multi-volumes that have been called Gnazim v'Tshuvas Chazon Ish, and there we see some of the materials that Tzvi Pesach Frank published in this Kovetz Kerem Tzion. The Chazon Ish wrote sharp responses to that. Anyway, this might be somewhat what's behind why, on some level, there's different approaches in halacha and in learning, and Tzvi Pesach Frank in Bnei Brak is not necessarily looked at, especially in the newer generation. Okay, now, going on that note, I'm looking at the Sefer. You look at Akdama. We spoke about there was a Yid, which in America for sure not, but in Yerushalayim also, Reb Zalman Auerbach. Zalman Auerbach was an expert on Zerayim and wrote Madani Aretz on Trumas and on Shvius, and also in this Kailo. So does Rav Chaim Kanievsky quote the Sefer? That's the question. So it's not in the introduction. He doesn't quote it. So I was wondering the whole time, always, does he quote it or not? And I remember that I'm pretty sure he does. Okay. But before we get to if he does or not, in the Kreine de Igersa, which is the letters of the Chazon Ish, of the Stipler, incredible letters, there's a letter about the Sefer Madani Aretz on Trumas U'Maisros of Reb Zalman. And he says like this: thanks for giving me the Sefer, he says to Reb Zalman, he says, Ke'ein Sefer Minchas Chinuch, Shemilvad Chidushav Aniflam, besides for its amazing Chidushim, who oitzer blum mikol deis apoiskim, kadmoy ubasroi. And Bekitzer, it's a chibur nifla, and should be zeicha to put out many more different chiburim. So it has a glowing askama from the Stipler, and by Rav Chaim Kanievsky, everything by his father is Kodesh Kadashim. So you would want to know, does he quote it? The answer is he definitely does. He quotes Madani Aretz many, many times. It's hard to find through searches because it's Rosh Tevis. I don't know what he quotes it, Keseder. I don't know how much he does in Shvius, but definitely in Trumas HaMaisros. In Trumas, he quotes him all the time. Okay. Now, another person that we mentioned in the previous episode was Rabbi Yosef Halevi. Now, this Rabbi Yosef, at the time, I said, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Halevi, sorry. So Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Halevi was the Rav of Tel Aviv. So, again, I mentioned already then, he wrote a bunch of massive works on Zerayim. So you would think that it would be mentioned Hagdama, it's not, it should be quoted somewhere in the Sefer, Rav Chaim Derech Emunah, it's not quoted, and I don't know why not. But the question is even stronger, and that is, again, we refer you to the Kreine, the Igrasa of the Stipler. And he has a letter, if I can find it, 1 second. Someone seemed to have asked the Stipler a question. Halacha says, I don't know. I don't paskin shailas, but where did I used to send people for halachic shailas? This is in 1964. I used to send to Rabbi Yosef Halevi, Av Bezdin of Yafo. So after I see this letter, and this letter was brought up on the internet in a thread all about some interesting information about this Rabbi Yosef Halevi. I don't have an answer, and they did not either have an answer why he's not quoted. He wrote massive svarim. I don't know any political. I don't think that I can't think of any political things. Furthermore, he was very Litvish oriented. I mentioned before he opened up. He founded a Grushul in Tel Aviv, which a lot has been written about, because his Shver put out the Siddur HaGra. And recently, in the past few months, two new editions came out of the Siddur HaGra. Al Kapanim, for the life of me, I don't know why. He was very, very much Meiser Nefesh for Hilchos Eretz Yisrael, and he wrote numerous svarim. So again, the answer would be is the letter from Rav Chaim Kanievsky. He says, I'm not trying to quote everything. So it could be he just pushed it in Davis life. He also wrote 4 volumes, and he didn't want to have to write 6 volumes. And each one of this Rabbi Yosef's volumes are massive, 700. Some of them are like 700 pages. Okay, maybe that's the answer. Fine. Okay, now I would just like to conclude with one last person. And this last person we already discussed a little bit in the previous episode. And now I just would like to talk a little bit about him. And this will be the conclusion of this episode. And that is as follows. I mentioned that we mentioned already a bunch of times is what's the goal of Rav Chaim Kanievsky over here? The goal is to collect the Chazon Ish, to bring down the Chazon Ish. Did anyone else ever think of doing this beforehand? Answer is yes. Rav Kalman Kahana did this beforehand. So now the question is, who's this Rav Kalman Kahana? And more so, do we find Rav Kalman Kahana mentioned anywhere in Derech Emunah? Okay, so let's backtrack. We'll do this very fast. As follows like this. Rav Kalman Kahana is born in Germany. Okay? He's born in, I believe it was 1910. He gets a degree in the Berlin Seminary, and he was also in university in Germany. And a tremendous Talmud Chacham. He marries a Rav in Germany, a very chashuv person, Reb Baruch Kunstadt. Reb Baruch Kunstadt ends up being the founder of yeshivas called Torah in Eretz Yisrael. And he assists his father-in-law in Germany still with running the Kehillah. Okay. Now, not only does he assist his father-in-law running the Kehillah, he was very Isaac in Eretz Yisrael. And also, just to point out, he was a big Talmud of the Sridei Eish, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg. Okay, and he wrote various Hespedim that he published various Hespedim that he gave when he died, and articles about him. Anyway, he was very close with the Dailim. Besides, as Shver was a Chashuv Rav in Germany, and as I said, he opens up Kal Torah for us Americans. That's the yeshiva there. Shlomo Zalman becomes Rosh Yeshiva there. Now, so Kalman Kahana, this Yeki Yid, he was so Meiser Nefesh already before when he's in Germany, so that he wanted to teach Hilchos Tluyos Ba'aretz. So the only sefer, which is a sefer we discussed already a few times, the Sharei Tzedek of the Chai Adam. But in Germany, they did not have in the late 20s, early 30s copies of this. They had one copy, and they didn't have photocopying machines like we have. So it seems what he did was he copied by hand complete prukim to give out from the one copy that was in the Frankfurt Library, and to give it out to his talmidim so he could learn and teach them Hilchos Tluyos Ba'aretz. And this is how Shmuel Emanuel, in an article that he wrote, Shmuel Emanuel, an article he wrote in Hamayan in a few, approximately 10 years ago, about Rav Kalman Kahana. This is where began Rav Kalman Kahana's obsession, so to speak, about learning Mitzvahs Tluyos Ba'aretz, which he was Isaac, as I'm about to explain, for 55 years in this topic. Now, he puts out many different svarim. One of them was all about Shemitah. In the beginning, it was called Shnas HaSheva, different editions. And in this Hagdama of Shnas HaSheva, he has a whole arichos how to teach a curriculum about Zerayim. Very, very interesting. I believe it's on Hebrew Books. Very interesting how to teach it. And the importance, how young people need to know it. And the significance over here is that this person was very concerned with, everyone needs to know it. You learn Hilchos Shabbos. How do you know Hilchos Shabbos? As your parents know what to do, but you're coming to Eretz Yisrael, you don't know what to do. So it needs to be part of the curriculum. So he explains how it should be part of the curriculum. Anyway, moving on, is he comes to Eretz Yisrael, and he writes various questions to Rav Chaim, and he publishes some of these letters in a beautiful book, which I quoted already more than once, so Ish V'Chazayinah. And he quotes some of these letters, and he's asking all different questions about areas of Eretz Yisrael. Rav Chaim says, there's a chashuv Yid in Eretz Yisrael, Chazon Ish, send your questions to him. This is what develops into a very close relationship, extremely close. Now, this relationship was so close that all different areas of halacha relating to Zerayim, he was a Rav in a kibbutz, so he brought them to the Chazon Ish, and he went with the Chazon Ish up all these halachas. Okay, now he puts, and not only that, he puts out for the masses a lot of the halachas of Eretz of Mitzvahs Tois Ba'aretz, also al pi the psakim of the Chazon Ish, which is that's what's very significant. Okay, very good. Now, one of the things that he was like, I think I mentioned already previously, he put out a sefer on Hilchos Nida that became the go-to sefer on Hilchos Nida based on Psakim of the Chazon Ish. Now, one of the things is he's loichim the milchama for the Chazon Ish and Shemitah, so much so that he fights against Tzvi Pesach Frank. He even publishes in one of his Seforim a whole sort of attack on Tzvi Pesach Frank, which someone in Yerushalayim goes ahead and puts out a chibur to defend Tzvi Pesach Frank. And then some people in Bnei Brak say that chibur is too sharp, even though but okay, anyway, like everything else, turns out that even though Rav Kalman Kahana published a defense of the Chazon Ish on Shemitah against Tzvi Pesach Frank, recent auctions have shown, they printed the documents, it turns out he was really just straight up Chazon Ish. For some reason, the Chazon Ish didn't want it under his own name. He had Rav Kalman Kahana printed. This document is 7 pages. You could see it on the internet. It went on auction for 27 pages of the Chazon Ish. Xaviad, $20,000. It's actually very little. They expected it should go for much more. Anyway, this is in recent years. Now, I'm not going into all the different aspects of whatever's going on over here, but anyway, he's loichim the milchama of the Chazon Ish Shita for everyone of Shemitah all over Eretz Yisrael. Okay, and one last point of significance is he writes. They publish in the standard Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I think I said it already before, but they put in the back Hilchos Tluyos Ba'aretz, 15-20 pages for the curriculum of school kids, even based on the psakim of the Chazon Ish. Who does this? Rav Kalman Kahana. So, not only is he the person that's fighting the milchama in Shemitah and other things and getting it out there, and he puts out other svarim for Hamoyin Am, and he has conversation. We're not talking about a guy that, he's a good writer, so to speak. He was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, and he was holding in Zerayim Be'iyun. So his interest, so I'm saying is he was very involved with Hilchos Zerayim with the Chazon Ish. So you would think somewhere it's going to be mentioned in Derech Emunah, his name. So it is. It turns out there's a Rosh Tevis Hey Vav somewhere buried in Hilchos Shemitah. Rav Kalman Kahana, I don't think was even alive when this came out already. But in the Sefer HaSvarim, which is the Einikol put out, it says it's referring to Rav Kalman Kahana. That we say the Sefer HaIsh v'Chizayna is quoted once for a few different psakim. Somehow gets in there, but the material of Rav Kalman Kahana for Zerayim, it's not mentioned. Okay, what's the answer to this question? And the answer is as follows. And I'm not obviously this is above my pay grade to talk about these things, so I'm definitely not talking about. I'm just going to mention a nakuda and leave you with this. In Eretz Yisrael, there's a nakuda there's halacha and then there's politics. Now, politics is the gedolim are involved with politics. It's not just politicians. Rav Kalman Kahana, who was a tremendous Talmud Chacham and tremendous Yirei Shamayim, and he was a Talmud of Gedolei Olam, and he was had a tremendous close relationship with the Chazon Ish. He was also the one of the heads of a political party known as Pi. And this topic is endless, and Pi, it seems, at different times had different frictions with different Gedolim, although they had some of their own Gedolim. And there's even very, very sharp letters that the Chazon Ish wrote. It seems it's not clear if he meant that Rav Kalman Kahana should see it, that he had charota about it, all these documents. Sometimes they get leaked, as they say. Were they supposed to get leaked? Weren't they supposed to get leaked? Incredible documents where in these documents one sees about the Chazon Ish and how one's supposed to listen to a gadol for all areas. And anyway, they're printed in different places. And, of course, there's always new scoops coming up about them. But it has to do with Pi. Now, just to explain what I mean, it's more than that. A sefer came out a bunch of years ago on the stipler called Toldos Yaakov. Now, who wrote the sefer Toldos Yaakov? The grandson, Avram Yeshaya Kanievsky. Who's that? The son of the stipler. And it's a very reliable book. He knew the stipler. And who gives a haskama? A beautiful letter from Rav Chaim Kanievsky. I'm glancing through the book, and all of a sudden I come across about Pi, 2 pages of quotes that are taken from the Kreina Digrasa. After one reads these quotes, one can understand why Rav Chaim Kanievsky is not going to quote Rav Kalman Kahana anywhere in his Derech Emunah. Now, what does this mean? You have to understand. It's not just that Rav Kalman Kahana was this guy and he wrote Psakim of the Chazon Ish. He not single-handedly, but he was major in Tizram. He wrote dozens of articles be'iyun in holding Tizram. Not only did he write dozens of articles, he printed some of the Rishonim from manuscript that we have on Bikurim and on Shvius. He put it out with fancy editions. But even more than that, this is where the story in Eretz Yisrael always gets interesting. Today, one of the greatest kolos that are involved with Zerayim was headed by Rav Yosef Efrati, Talmud Muvuk of Rabbi Yashiv. So you'll want to know who started this kollel. So you can say Rabbi Efrati did. No. Rabbi Efrati took over, and it says it on all the paperwork, everywhere. You look always. They don't hide this. The kollel was founded by Rav Kalman Kahana. I mean, say his obsession with Eretz Yisrael. Not only his obsession, he printed tons and tons of Torah articles in the journal Hamayan, which is also affiliated more with the Pai. He published and wrote and on all types of, as I'm saying, pieces, and he's defending the Chazon Ish till the end. So much so that the Rav Dinkels, who I quoted, who was a person that had to do with the Chazon Ish, one of the articles, Rav Kalman Kahana defends the Chazon Ish from the various hasagas of Rav Dinkel. This is Saif Yamav even. So Rav Kalman Kahana was always Isaac in it. So Isaac in it, not just Isaac in it, he opened up a kollel about it, he printed Rishonim, Achrayim, Halacha L'maisa Seforim about it, and it's now headed by Rav Efrati Talmud Muvuk of Rabbi Yashiv, who is the father of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Anyway, as they say in Eretz Yisrael, I'm an American, so I definitely do not understand this. I don't think I'll ever be able to understand it. This is where two things clash. It's called halacha and politics. Anyway, I'm not a commentator on these type of inyanim. We'll leave it up to people that are much better suited for these type of topics. But just this is why you will find that Rav Kalman Kahana is I told you he's mentioned once in Hilchos Shmita, even though he did so much for Eretz Yisrael of Hilchos Mitzvah Sois Words, but more so for the Chazon Ish. This was the person who made the Chazon Ish to the masses. His halachas getting it out there. So much so, we'll conclude with this last sentence: the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, to show you the world of politics. So for 30 years, 40 years, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Eshkol, Standard One, that were printed in thousands and thousands of copies that students of all types are using, which is based on Kalman Kahana / Chazon Ish. Bnei Brak has a different edition of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch today. Shapsi Frankel has different halachas, Mitzvah Sois Words, probably also based on Chazon Ish, but doesn't say anywhere with Kalman Kahana, because it could be they wrote them up in a different thing to make it. As I said, politics and halacha only clash. Ad kan for this episode, and Amir Hashem will now get to into the meat of the actual sefer and to the methods of Rav Chaim Kanievsky in learning itself.
Amazing. So just to conclude, thank you very much. There's so much fascinating information there. So those who got the Shavuos edition of the Mishpacha magazine, Reb Davi Safir, in his fascinating article on Rabbi Dr. Leo Jung, actually mentions Kalman Kahana, and he says they were very, very close friends. So that's that. Anyone who wants that article, either get a hold of the Mishpacha magazine, or we have connections we could get you a copy of that article. Amazing article. And I have to say one thing. Rabbi Moshe Elephant, who runs the Kashrus department at the OU, I've heard this from him quite a few times. He says when you go shopping in Eretz Yisrael, down the grocery aisle, you're not just like looking for your groceries. It's like elections. I vote for the Badatz. Do I vote for the Goodness Yisrael? Do I vote for Bells? Deciding on what you pick. Okay, so that's for today's comedy. Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Eliezer, and we'll follow up again. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see.